Today is March 7th, 2023, Tuesday afternoon, about 4 o'clock in the afternoon. Another video on old school versus new school baseball players. Which era of baseball had better stats and accomplishments and achievements? First era that I consider is from 1872, baseball era, from 1872 through 1949. I call it old school baseball. Then from 1950 through the present day, 2022, I consider new school baseball. So I did some research, wrote a book. I've done some videos. I have in this book 33 chapters. I am looking to see who is better, who is greater, who is more dominant. Here's the question. Who played baseball better and had better accomplishments? Old school baseball players or new school baseball players? Well, I did a chapter on batting average. Old school won. Look at that video. I did a chapter on most hits in a season by players. Old school won. Old school baseball players beat new school baseball players. I did a chapter on runs scored. Old school won again. That's 3-0 their record against new school as far as runs scored. Then I did runs batted in. This is the first time that the new school beat the old school. Now I'm focusing on Hall of Fame players. I'm looking at each decade and then getting a cumulative average of the decade. And then I added up all the decades to get an aggregate. And so far, the score of those four categories I've just discussed, batting average, most hits, runs scored, and runs batted in, the score is 3-1 old school, winning as far as stats. This video will be chapter 5, home runs, in this book. I looked up the home run leaders in each year and average the decade. 1870s, the average was 2 home runs per year. The high was Jim O'Rourke from 1872 to 1879. The high, Jim O'Rourke had 6 home runs one year. So in the 1870s, they weren't hitting homers. 1880s, what's the average? 12 homers. Who had the most during that decade? Cap Hansen, 21. 1890s, the average homers, 14 for a 10-year period. Who had the most? Ed Delonte had 19. 1900s, the average of home runs, 9. Who had the most? Sam Crawford, 16. 1910s, the average for home runs is 11. And who had the most? Babe Ruth had 29. 1920s, the average goes way up because of Babe Ruth. The average for the decade, 49 home runs. And who had the most? Babe Ruth had 60. 1930s, the average for home runs was 48. And who had the most? 1930s, Jimmy Fox had 58. So did Hank Greenberg. And then the 1940s, the average was 37 homers. And who had the most? Ralph Kiner, 54. So the aggregate for that 75-year period from 1870s through the 1940s, the aggregate was 22 home runs per decade. That's the average. Because you add each year who had the high total for the year, and then you take a 10-year period and average it out. 22 home runs. How did the new schoolers do? New school baseball do? Well, they did better. 1950s, the average was 45 home runs. And who had the most? Mickey Mantle had 52. 1960s, the average 47. Who had the most? Mickey Mantle had 54. 1970s, the average 42. And who had the most? Willie Stargell, 48. 1980s, the average 38. Goes down in the 80s. There was a strike year. The average is 38 for the 1980s. And who had the most? Andre Dawson had 49. 1990s, the average 44, so it went up. Who had the most? Ken Griffey, 56. The 2000s, the average 42. Who had the most? David Ortiz had 54. And then the 2010s, the average goes down to 33. And who had the most? David Ortiz had 38. So what's the aggregate for that 75-year period from 1950 through the present time? The average is 41 home runs per decade. No, 41 for the 7 decades. So I told you the new school was 22 and the old school was 22 home runs from 1872 to 1949. The average, the aggregate. And for the new school, the aggregate total is 41. So new school beats old school in home runs. Just recap it. Start off with the 1870s, very low, right? 1870s are not hitting homers. 2, 1880s, 12. 1890s, 14. 1900s, 9. Very strange. 1990s is 14, but the 1900s is 9. It went down. 1910s is 11. 1920s is 49. They were way up. 1930s is up to 48, and then the 1940s, 37. But the new school does way better because in the 50s, the average is 45. In the 60s, 47. 70s, 42. 80s, 38. 90s, 44. 2000s, 42. And the 2010s, 33. New school wins. So after 5 categories, it's old school 3 and new school 2 as far as wins, as far as who is better in a certain category. What do you think? You agree or disagree? Batting average, old school. Most hits in a season, old school. Runs scored, old school. Runs batted in, new school. Home runs, new school. Next video, triples. Then after that, we're going to do doubles, singles, slugging, on base, total bases, base on balls, stolen bases. So we'll do those categories. It will be 13 categories of offense. Who wins? Who will come out the winner? Who is better, old school or new school? Stay tuned. I'm out.